guys remember that show, Thrill Seekers? Probably not, it's an old show. Well, we're Thrill Seekers today. We literally just pulled this 6-liter early model JK build right out of the shop and onto the freeway. We're heading to Utah. We're going from Las Vegas to northern Utah, and literally this Jeep has just got gas and hit the road. We're going to see how it goes. We'll check the economy. You know, the last couple of drives that we did were with LTs, 8 speeds, 10 speeds. GM just dropped the L96 out of the lineup, which is too bad because it's a great motor. This is a new crate engine. This customer was lucky to get one before they were discontinued. We do have a couple of left in our inventory, but once they're gone, they're gone. So we'll track the economy and performance and be back. I can hear those light bars singing in the wind. We're about halfway from Las Vegas to Park City. We've been bombing along here at about 80 miles an hour for, I don't know, an hour and a half. The speedometer on this vehicle's off about 6 miles an hour, so we're going 80. But notice we're at 2,600 RPM. This vehicle is definitely overgeared. I'd like to see that tachometer down about 2,300 at 80. So, as is pretty normal in Utah this time of the year, we ran into some snow and bad weather. High winds mainly. So we're fighting a headwind and really cold temps. So the mileage on this 6.0 hasn't been spectacular. We're pushing just about 12 miles to the gallon, but we have been cruising at about 80 miles an hour. We're running low-grade fuel, and we're also running some pretty steep gears. My guess is if he were to remove some of the drag on this vehicle, gear down numerically, I think he could pick up a couple of miles to the gallon easy. But the 6.0 is really very drivable. It's very docile, and even spinning it up at 2,500 RPM is very, there's no stress, there's no drama associated with it. It's not like a Pennstar revving up to 5,000 or 4,000. I said in the last video that we talk more about gearing. It's an important subject, and there's a lot of variables. The weight of your Jeep, where do you operate your Jeep, what engine you have, what tire size you have, altitude and all that. So we're going to get more into depth in that subject. So our trip from Las Vegas to Park City and back went without a hitch, as I would expect with a 6-liter. There really were no concerns. There were some observations. The gearing in this Jeep is pretty short, meaning it's spinning the engine up. At 80 miles an hour, we are pushing about 2,500 RPM. And as we talked about in the last couple of videos, in order to get the most out of your V8, you really need to gear it properly. I think he's running, and I'm guessing here, 37s with maybe 513s. It's got too much gear in it for regular use. Here's the thing, this Jeep might have too much gear or it might not. It just depends what he's going to do with it. Now, cruising at 80 miles an hour down the highway, the gears are too short. But if this guy's towing a trailer up in the mountains, it might be just what he wants. Or if he trailers it to the trail and back, then these gears are going to work perfect. So let's talk a little bit about our recommended gearing. And when I say overall gearing or a general gear, what I'm talking about is the average guy who drives on the highway and then off-roads, maybe on the weekend, a couple of days a week. He's not in Colorado going over the 12,000 foot passes while towing a trailer. We're talking about a Jeep that's based anywhere from sea level to 3,000 or 4,000 feet. You drive it every day to work, you get it on the highway, and you go off-road occasionally. There, of course, are other factors like the weight of your Jeep, and the larger the tire, the heavier they are. So if you've got a 32-inch tire, even a 34 or 5-inch tire, you might be 100, 125 pounds per corner, but then you step up to a 40 or 42, you could be pushing 1,000 pounds of wheels and tires. And remember, you have to accelerate and decelerate those. So that can also have an effect on the gear ratio versus RPM calculation. So with the smaller tires, let's say a 32, you're perfectly fine going with a 321 or a 373. I ran 321s in a 5.3 JK for 100,000 miles, and that Jeep got excellent gas mileage. We were turning about 1,700 RPM on the highway. It was a manual transmission JK, so it had those tall gears in it. And it worked great. Now, did it launch really hard? No, not really, but it launched hard enough. And on the highway, it would occasionally downshift. But those small tires were just such a light load. And I noticed this with the minivans and stuff. With these really small tires that don't require a lot of energy to turn them, you can get away with some really tall gears. And GM is putting really tall gears in the new Suburbans and Escalades and all that, even down into the 2s. So with the small tires, you can kind of choose. If you want good highway economy, go with the 321. If you want a good all-around gear, go with maybe a 355. If you want to have some good performance, go with the 373. Now let's step up to where most of you guys are at with a 35-inch tire. That's where I was at for a long time. 410s work great, off-road and on-road. It's going to put you right about 2,000 RPM at 70 miles an hour, maybe 2,300 RPM at 80 miles an hour. It's very comfortable at those speeds, yet it still has really good performance on the bottom end. We step up to a 37. My preferred gear is a 456. You want to tow, you're high altitude, your JK is excessively heavy, go to a 488. You want to do long highway cruising, go to a 410. I've got 410s with 37s in my personal JK now, and I'm getting about 17, 18 miles to the gallon on the highway. My Jeep is light, it doesn't have a lot of drag on it, and I like the 410 gears. They work just fine. We step up to 40s. Maybe your Jeep's heavy, you got 1 tons hydraulics. The 513 makes a great overall gear. Now remember, there's always qualifiers. If you got 40s on your Jeep and you're going to be doing mostly wheeling, then the 538s work just fine. I got a lot of guys with 40s and 538s. They like that bottom end power, they like the extra torque off-road, and it's still going to be pretty comfortable on the highway. You might sacrifice a little bit of economy, but it's not really that big of a deal. And here's the other side of it. We have 6, 8, and 10-speed transmissions. When you were stuck with a 4-speed transmission and a 3.8, it was really bad when the thing had a downshift because it might jump up 1,000 RPM, and you only got 4 choices of gears. So one gear may not be optimal. In fact, no gear may be optimal. It might not like 3rd and it might not like 4th. It might want to be somewhere in between. And that's exactly what these high gear transmissions do. So you'll notice the 10-speed and the 8-speed, they might run in 6th, they might run in 7th, they might run in 8th, whatever, but they just run where they're comfortable, and you have that choice. You don't have to upshift and you don't have to downshift. With the LTs, you have the cam phasing, which also helps. Instead of downshifting the transmission, it phases the cam. So you have a lot more options. Now you have to take the technology into account. The early LS with a 6-speed without VVT versus a late model LT1 with a 10-speed, they're somewhat different. But they're all V8s and they all have larger cubic inches than the stock engines, and they have more gears than the 4 and the 5 speeds. So anything you do is not going to be as dramatic as if you had the V6 with a 4 or a 5 speed. I see guys with 35s and 538s with a V6, and they're always screaming, going up and down the mountain passes. They're always revving up, and yeah, the Penstars will pull your JK up those hills at 70, 80 miles an hour. I've done it, but a V8 will do the same thing at a much lower RPM and in much more comfort. So if you were to have 35s and 538s in your V8, it's just not going to be that comfortable. So let's talk about some of the factors that can affect the gearing. If you have a JK that's really heavy, you got full steel skid plates, rock rails, steel bumpers, winch, the whole 9 yards, you're probably going to be adding 800, 1,000 pounds plus to your vehicle. Altitude, if you're at sea level in Miami or Los Angeles, the air is thicker than it is at high altitude, let's say 10,000 feet. They say you lose about 3% air density per 1,000 feet. So at 10,000 feet, you're losing about 30% of your air density, which is about 30% of your power. You can gain a little bit of that back by gearing down a size. And I tell my customers in Colorado to do that, especially the guys living up there at 6,000 feet plus. Most of them tow little utility trailers. You want to step down one size in gearing. Tire size. Like I said, a little tire is a lot easier to spin than a big tire. So it's not proportional. The larger tire you go, there's a geometric progression in the weight of that wheel on tire. Stepping up from a 513 to a 538 with a 40 is not going to be as dramatic as if you stepped up from, let's say, a 410 to a 456 with 35s. We have to talk about the transmission because transmission is critical in gearing. All of the LS and LT transmissions that we support have a 4-to-1 or lower first gear. 4-to-1, 4.6-to-1. If you look at the Chrysler transmissions, the 4 and the 5 speeds, they're about 3-to-1. So we're 25% lower in that first gear, which means now we can go to a taller final axle ratio and still have an overall lower overall ratio. It's interesting sometimes to watch guys get into the V8 for the first time and hit the gas pedal, because with the V6 you give it about half throttle and that just makes the vehicle move. You give it about half throttle with a V8 and any of the V8s and you chirp the tires basically. And part of that is the V8, but part of that's also that low first gear. And that low first gear is also what launches you, turns those big tires, and when you're off-road helps you negotiate the obstacles with ease. So not only does the low first gear in a transmission benefit you and giving you more diverse choices in the final drive ratio, but so does the top gear. The 6, 8, and 10 speeds all have pretty tall overdrives. 0.6, 0.66. If you look at the Chrysler transmissions, the 4 and the 5 speeds, they were about 0.8. So we got a lower low and a higher high. So this means you can run that steeper gear and get lower RPMs on the highway. The overall effect is gearing is not as critical. If you were to go from a 410 to a 456 and a V8, it's not going to be as critical as if you went from a 410 to a 456 with a V6. You have less gears, you have a taller first gear, you have a shorter high gear, so the V8 just isn't as picky. But you do want to set it up right for best economy and performance. And as far as economy goes, the taller the gear, the better, essentially. If you've got a really tall gear and you're lugging the engine and downshifting constantly, then you're going to want to step up one size in the gear ratio chart. On the other hand, if you never downshift on the highway, you're doing a lot of highway driving, you might want to go one size taller. But you have our general recommendations for the gear ratios that we find work the best. I will say that the LTs have kind of shifted the table a bit. Having the high compression, direct injection, making them more diesel-like means that they do lend themselves better to the numerically lower ratios. Like I said, Chevrolet is running really tall gears in their production vehicles, and the LTs really like to be loaded down. You have to load an LT down to get the best drivability out of it. If you have a really short gear in an LT, it's like a go-kart, and the transmission is just watt, 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 watt. You want to load it down and use the long legs of that engine to move your vehicle rather than just spin up. So we're going to hit the trail with this 6-liter JK, and we're going to be back with some exciting stuff.